The deadliest pandemic of the 20th century doesn't have an accurate name. 50 to 100 million people died, and we can't even get the label right, because the Spanish flu did not start in Spain. Spain was simply the only country not lying about it. That single fact is the thread that unravels everything. Every history book ever printed has been wrong on the cover page, and the misidentification wasn't an accident. It was the direct consequence of the same wartime censorship apparatus that let the pandemic kill as freely as it did. It's 1918. The world is 4 years into a war that has already consumed 17 million lives. Governments in Britain, France, the United States and Germany are running censorship operations of staggering sophistication, controlling newspapers, suppressing casualty figures, even managing the information their populations receive down to the paragraph. A lethal epidemic spreading through military training camps and trenches is precisely the kind of story those governments cannot allow to exist in print. So it doesn't. Soldiers collapse in barracks from Kansas to the Western Front. The machinery of wartime propaganda is so well oiled that a civilization-scale catastrophe barely registers in the press of the countries it is destroying. Spain is neutral. When a mysterious respiratory illness sweeps through Madrid in the spring of 1918, Spanish newspapers cover it openly, in accumulating detail, with the horror the story actually deserves. When King Alfonso XIII falls visibly, seriously ill, that becomes front-page news. The rest of the world, starved of accurate information from their own governments, here looks at Spanish reporting and draws the obvious wrong conclusion. The disease gets a name, the name sticks. What we know with absolute certainty is the scale. 500 million people infected. 1/3 of every human being alive on the planet at that moment. The dead, somewhere between 50 and 100 million. A range that wide because record-keeping in 1918 was inconsistent, and in many parts of the world practically non-existent. Consider the arithmetic another way. 4 years of industrialized slaughter on the Western Front, the most mechanically efficient killing operation humanity had yet devised, produced roughly 17 million dead. The Spanish flu matched and then exceeded that total in 24 months. In terms of raw mortality velocity, nothing in recorded human history comes close to what happened between the spring of 1918 and the early months of 1920. And we still don't know where it started. 3 serious hypotheses exist, sitting on 3 different continents, unresolved after more than 100 years. The first points to Haskell County, Kansas, in January 1918, where a local doctor named Loring Minor reported an unusually virulent influenza to public health authorities, an observation so alarming he felt compelled to file it officially, which was rare. Soldiers from that region trained at Camp Funston, which reported hundreds of sick men that spring. From training camps, troop movements carried the virus east. Ships carried it to Europe. The second hypothesis looks to southern China, where dense populations of humans and animals, including the bird species that serve as influenza's evolutionary reservoir, create ideal conditions for a novel strain to emerge. Chinese workers were moving through Canada and across the Atlantic as part of the Allied labour network. The viral pathway is plausible. The documentation is sparse. The third hypothesis is perhaps the most unsettling. Etaples, France, 1916. A British military hospital camp there reported a respiratory illness, producing unusually severe lung damage, the defining pathological signature of the pandemic strain, 2 years before the main wave. If Etaples was the origin point, the disease gestated inside the war itself, fed by the immunological stress of millions of malnourished, traumatized men breathing the same air as millions of rats. No consensus. The origin remains open. What is not open is the mortality pattern, because the mortality pattern is one of the strangest features in the entire history of infectious disease. Normal influenza kills a predictable population, the very young and the very old, the immunocompromised. The Spanish flu inverted this almost completely. Young adults between 20 and 40, people in peak physical condition, with the most robust immune systems of their lives, died at catastrophic rates. The standard U-shaped mortality curve became a W. That anomalous middle spike demanded an explanation. The answer, worked out by researchers decades later, is biological horror of the most counterintuitive kind. When the H1N1 strain penetrated the lungs of a healthy young adult, the powerful immune system it encountered recognized something profoundly foreign and responded with everything it had. Cytokines, the chemical signals coordinating immune response, flooded the body. The immune system didn't just fight the virus, it flooded its own lungs with fluid in the process. Strong immune systems triggered a self-destructive overreaction that weaker systems simply didn't generate at the same intensity. Your greatest biological protection became the mechanism of your death. Autopsies found lungs so saturated with fluid that pathologists described them as waterlogged. Soldiers reportedly turned blue at the lips from oxygen deprivation before dying within hours of first symptoms. Some accounts describe men who felt well at breakfast and were dead before nightfall. Meanwhile, the governments of the major powers watched this unfold and said nothing useful to their populations. Public health officials who wanted to warn people found themselves in direct conflict with war departments that considered panic a strategic liability. The virus moved freely. Information about the virus did not. The consequences of that choice became starkly visible in 2 American cities that autumn, during the second wave, the deadliest of the 3. Philadelphia held a parade. On September 28th, 1918, with the second wave already building in nearby military camps, city officials authorized a Liberty Loan parade to boost war bond sales. 200,000 people lined the streets. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in the city was full. Within a week, the death rate was climbing so fast that the city ran out of coffins. Bodies were stored in homes, priests drove trucks through neighborhoods collecting the dead. By the time the wave crested, Philadelphia had lost more than 12,000 people in 6 weeks. St. Louis received the same virus, but its health commissioner, Dr. Max Starkloff, closed schools, banned public gatherings, and shuttered saloons and churches within 48 hours of the first civilian cases, before political consensus existed, before he had permission over significant public resistance. The peak death rate in St. Louis was 1/8 of Philadelphia's. 1/8, same virus, same weeks, different decisions. The gap between those 2 outcomes was measured entirely in choices made by specific people in positions of authority. The pandemic came in 3 waves. The first, spring 1918, was severe but not unprecedented, and the second, autumn 1918, was catastrophic. The third swept through winter 1919 into 1920, deadlier than the first but less than the second, and then the pandemic simply ended. Not eradicated. H1N1 strains descended from the 1918 pandemic are still circulating today. But the catastrophic mortality phase was over. Why the second wave was deadliest, why the pattern unfolded in the sequence it did, these questions remain genuinely unresolved more than a century later. Then there is India. 12 to 17 million people dead. That 5 million person margin of uncertainty alone tells you something about how carefully the dying was recorded. The Spanish flu arrived through the same troop movement networks that carried it everywhere else, and it moved through a population already stressed by wartime grain requisitions and the economic disruptions of a war India had been conscripted into fighting for an empire not its own. The mortality was so severe in some regions that eyewitness accounts describe villages where the dead outnumbered those well enough to bury them. Yet the Indian catastrophe occupies almost no space in Western historical memory of the pandemic. The geography of tragedy maps almost perfectly onto the geography of power, and the people who died in the greatest numbers were least visible to the historians who later decided what the pandemic meant. 675,000 Americans died. That figure is more precisely documented, more frequently cited, more thoroughly memorialized than the 10 million or more who perished in India. Both were real. One was legible to history in ways the other was not. This is the deeper vertigo underneath the wrong name. It's not just that we called it Spanish. The entire event, its origins, its mechanisms, its geography of death, has been systematically distorted by the same forces that censored it while it was happening. Power shapes not just the present response to catastrophe, but the future memory of it. The Spanish flu killed more people than any single event in the 20th century, and we have been misunderstanding it ever since, in ways that begin with the label and extend all the way to which deaths we decided to count. But the Spanish flu, for all its ferocity, was not the worst. To find something that matches or exceeds it in proportional human destruction, you have to go back 600 years, to a harbour in Sicily, was in October of 1347, where 12 ships from the Black Sea have just dropped anchor, and the sailors aboard are either dead or covered in swollen black lumps the size of eggs, weeping blood and pus, and stinking in a way the harbour officials have never smelled on living men. The harbour authorities at Messina ordered the ships out immediately. Turn around, leave, every ship, out of the harbour now. It was already too late. Messina's population had been on the docks. Messina's merchants had been thinking about the cargo, the rats that lived in every Mediterranean port, moving between ships and warehouses and city streets without any awareness that they were the infrastructure of catastrophe. They had already done what rats do. On those rats were fleas. And in those fleas was something no one on Earth in 1347 had the conceptual framework to see, name, or understand. Yersinia pestis travels in a flea's stomach. The bacterium colonizes the flea's digestive system so aggressively it creates a blockage, a plug of congealed bacteria in the valve between esophagus and stomach. When a blocked flea tries to feed, it draws blood from its host and cannot pass it through, so it regurgitates directly into the bite wound. With every feeding attempt, it injects bacteria. Rats are the reservoir. Fleas are the vector. Humans are incidental hosts, stumbled into when the rat population crashes and the fleas need new warm bodies. The entire mechanism is invisible, odorless, silent, and in 1347 completely beyond human conception. What the 14th century saw instead was a pestilence spreading along its trade routes with a speed that seemed supernatural. From Messina it moved to Catania, across the water to the Italian mainland. By early 1348 it had reached Genoa and Venice. By spring, Florence. By summer it had crossed the Alps. By the end of 1348 it had reached France, Spain, England, parts of Germany. By 1350, Scandinavia. The entire known world of European civilization, mapped and penetrated in roughly 3 years. Here is where history generates a problem that has never been cleanly resolved. Modern bubonic plague spreads at approximately 12 to 15 kilometers per year. The Black Death moved at up to 5 kilometers per day. That is not a rounding error. That is a difference of 2 orders of magnitude. A disease that modern epidemiology tracks in kilometers per year was crossing medieval Europe in kilometers per day. Multiple forms of transmission were operating simultaneously, not just the bubonic form via fleas, but the pneumonic form spreading directly through respiratory droplets, and the septicemic form requiring no flea at all once the bacterium reached the bloodstream. Some historians argue the Black Death wasn't purely bubonic plague, that what swept Europe was a package of diseases moving alongside and amplifying each other. The genetic evidence from mass graves confirms Yersinia pestis was present. Whether it was sufficient to explain everything it gets credit for remains genuinely contested. The bubonic form announced itself with fever and sudden exhaustion, then the swellings, lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, or neck swelling to grotesque size, turning black, exquisitely painful. So painful the sick could not bear the weight of clothing. Some buboes burst and drained, and occasionally a patient survived. Untreated mortality ran between 30 and 90%. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs and spread through breath alone, You needed only to be in the same room as someone coughing. Pneumonic plague, untreated, killed close to 100% of those it infected within 2 or 3 days. The septicemic form was faster still, overwhelming the blood before the immune system could organize any response, producing hemorrhaging beneath the skin. People with septicemic plague sometimes died before their buboes fully developed. In Florence in 1348, Giovanni Boccaccio watched all 3 forms move through what had been one of the most sophisticated urban centres in Europe. He survived. He wrote, "What he produced is the closest thing we have to an eyewitness account of what an epidemic at this scale actually does to human society. Not the statistics, not the mechanism, but the behaviour of people under conditions that dissolved every social bond they had believed was permanent. He described neighbours who shunned each other. He described the sick dying without attendance, abandoned even in their own homes. Kinsfolk held aloof," he wrote. "Brother was forsaken by brother, oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children to their fate." Read that slowly. Not monsters, not people of unusual cruelty. Ordinary Florentines who looked at a dying child and understood, correctly, that touching that child meant dying themselves. The disease stripped away the deepest biological imperatives and replaced them with something colder. Boccaccio also described the other extreme, people who responded to social collapse by abandoning all restraint, moving through the dying city in a kind of feverish reverie, eating and drinking and pursuing pleasure with the logic that nothing mattered now, that tomorrow was not guaranteed, so tonight was everything. Both responses, total withdrawal and desperate hedonism, were rational adaptations to an irrational situation. Both were evidence of a civilization trying to process something it had no framework for. What the streets of Florence actually sounded like in those months. A carter moving through neighbourhoods in the pre-dawn dark, calling for the dead. Doors would open, bodies would be brought out, sometimes wrapped, sometimes not, loaded onto carts already carrying other bodies. The cathedral bells rang so constantly for the dying that city authorities ordered them stopped because the sound was destroying what remained of public composure. Beyond the city walls, plague pits, mass graves dug in anticipation, filled faster than anticipated, dug again. There were not enough priests to say last rites, not enough grave diggers for individual interments, not enough coffins, a shortage that would repeat itself from London to Paris to Hamburg. Now hold those street-level details and look at the scale they were producing. Globally, somewhere between 75 and 200 million dead. Europe specifically, 30 to 60% of the entire population gone in under 5 years. England lost between 40 and 60% of its people. Italy lost approximately half. Whole villages disappeared from the records. Not abandoned, disappeared. The last entry in the account book, and then nothing. In the face of dying that violated every expectation about how the world worked, people searched for explanations that fit inside the worldview they had. The worldview of 14th century Europe was theological. If this magnitude of death was descending on the Christian world, then the Christian world had sinned. The flagellants appeared in Germany and spread across the continent. Groups of men moving from town to town in organised processions, publicly whipping themselves with leather straps embedded with metal studs, twice a day sometimes, believing their physical suffering would satisfy whatever divine anger had been unleashed. The Church eventually condemned the movement as heretical, partly because some flagellant leaders claimed their penance superseded the sacraments, that leather straps made priests unnecessary. But for years the processions continued, bleeding men moving through bleeding cities. The second explanation was not metaphysical, it was human, and it was murderous. Someone was doing this. Pestilence on this scale, following no logic that 14th century medicine could detect, had to have an agent, had to be a poison, had to be placed somewhere everyone went: the wells. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning water sources to cause the plague, an accusation that required ignoring the fact that Jewish populations were dying of the plague too, often at comparable or higher rates, because poverty concentrated them in more densely packed neighbourhoods with greater exposure. Logic was not the relevant mechanism, fear was, and fear of that magnitude, attached to a scapegoat already positioned by centuries of legal exclusion and theological hostility, produced massacres. In Strasbourg in February 1349, approximately 2,000 Jews were burned on a wooden platform in the Jewish cemetery, before the plague had even reached the city as a preventive measure. In Basel, the Jewish community was locked inside a wooden building and burned. In Mainz, thousands were killed. The Black Death did not create European anti-Semitism, but it poured through pre-existing fractures with the force of a flood, and the destruction it accelerated in those 3 years was permanent. When the dying finally unevenly slowed, when 1351 arrived and the bells began ringing less constantly, the world that remained was not the world of 1346. The survivors were standing in the ruins of a population base, an economic structure, a set of social arrangements, and a theological certainty that had taken centuries to build. Everything they had assumed was permanent had turned out to be contingent. But here is the thing about ruins. Sometimes what grows in them is extraordinary. When 40 to 60% of a population dies inside 4 years, every assumption about scarcity, about the value of labour, about who holds power over whom, all of it recalibrates simultaneously. For centuries, labour had been the abundant thing. Land was scarce and controlled. A serf worked a lord's fields because there was nowhere else to go, no structural shortage of human bodies willing to do agricultural work in exchange for the right to exist on someone else's land. The Black Death erased that surplus catastrophically, regionally, and without any mechanism of replacement. A lord whose estate had lost half its workforce could not conjure new workers from nothing. And that meant that for the first time in living memory, a surviving peasant could simply leave. Not theoretically leave, actually walk off the land, present himself at a depopulated village and negotiate. The word itself would have been incomprehensible to his grandfather. Serfs did not negotiate, but a lord with 50 surviving workers where he'd had 100, with crops needing harvest before the rains came, with no functional enforcement mechanism, that lord would pay what was asked. The wage records from England in the 2 decades after 1351 are some of the most striking economic documents of the medieval period. Real wages for agricultural labourers rose sharply, not gradually, not through planned reform, abruptly, driven by the brutal market reality of far fewer workers chasing roughly the same amount of work. The English Parliament tried to stop it. The Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It failed. You cannot fine a man for demanding higher wages when the magistrate who would impose the fine is dead, and the lord who would bring the complaint cannot afford to lose the labourer while the case is argued. Economic reality overrode legislative intent because economic reality was not interested in the legal preferences of the surviving aristocracy. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by Wat Tyler, demanding the abolition of serfdom, was brutally suppressed, its leaders executed. But the revolt happened because something real had changed in the relationship between peasant and landed class, something the plague had changed, and that something could not be unchanged by killing Wat Tyler. Serfdom in England effectively collapsed over the following century through the quiet accumulation of individual decisions by workers who understood, correctly, that they now had options. Across the landscape, something else was happening that left no written record but is preserved in pollen cores drilled from lake beds. The medieval agricultural expansion had pushed cultivation onto hillsides and into soils that barely produced enough to justify the labour. After 1351, those marginal fields were abandoned. Trees moved back in, Ice cores from Greenland and the Alps capture a dip in carbon dioxide concentrations in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Civilization exhaling, shrinking, pulling back. The planet registered what humanity had lost. The survivors, having watched every institution they trusted fail, having watched the church bury its priests alongside its congregants, having watched medicine offer dried toad poultices and a device to avoid bad air, began building new institutions from first principles. Venice moved fastest. By 1377, the Republic had established a formal system requiring arriving ships to anchor in harbour for a waiting period before passengers and crew could disembark. By the early 15th century, Venice and other northern Italian city-states had standardised on 40 days. 40 giorni, 40 days. The word quarantine enters the English language from Italian, carrying inside it the number that medieval port officials had decided through empirical trial rather than scientific understanding, was long enough to determine whether you were bringing plague into a city or simply bringing yourself. This was one of the first evidence-based public health interventions in Western history, not because anyone understood germ theory, but because port officials had observed repeatedly that ships from plague-affected regions brought plague with them, and that a waiting period seemed to correlate with reduced transmission. Observation preceding explanation by centuries is not unusual in the history of medicine. What is remarkable is that medieval Venice was doing it at all. Lazarettos, permanent quarantine stations built on islands in Venice's lagoon, became standard facilities, the first purpose-built public health infrastructure in the Western world. Bills of health, official documents certifying a ship's port of origin and the plague status of that port became required for entry into major harbours. Draw a line from Venice's 40 giorni through the international sanitary conventions of the 19th century to the World Health Organization, established in 1948, and what you find is a continuous institutional thread stretching back to the 14th century's desperate improvisation. The theological consequences were slower to manifest and harder to document, but scholars argue they may have been the most consequential of all. The Church had offered an explanation for everything: suffering, justice, the operation of the universe, and the Black Death tested that explanation at population scale and found it wanting. Priests died, not sinners more than priests as much as anyone, sometimes faster, because their vocation required approaching the sick. The authority lost between 1347 and 1380 was not the kind that disappears in a single dramatic confrontation. It eroded quietly, in private conversations between people who no longer quite believed what they were saying when they recited what they were supposed to believe. The academic argument, contested, no single cause produces Renaissance humanism or Protestant theology, is that the Black Death accelerated a shift in intellectual orientation away from the purely theological and toward the empirical, the individual, the human. Boccaccio himself is part of this evidence. His Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the Florence epidemic, is obsessed with human intelligence and human desire and human adaptability, not with divine intervention. That orientation, applied over the following century to philosophy, art, and eventually scripture itself, would prepare the ground for the Renaissance and then the Reformation. The plague didn't cause those movements. It destabilized the certainties that would have prevented them. What you can see in the art is less arguable than the intellectual history, because the art is there to be looked at. The Dance of Death became one of the dominant visual genres of the late medieval period. Skeletal figures leading the living, popes, emperors, merchants, peasants, without regard to rank, in a procession toward the grave. Skulls appear in paintings that have nothing else to do with death. Hourglasses, candles burning down, coffins in corners of portraits of living men in expensive clothes. An entire civilization working through collective trauma through imagery, returning obsessively to physical mortality, as though repetition could make it less terrifying. Or perhaps because there was no other way to live alongside what had happened, except to keep looking at it directly, Then there is the evidence written not in records or artworks, but in the human body itself. Genetic analysis of European populations in the past 2 decades has identified elevated frequencies of specific variants in genes associated with immune function among people whose ancestors lived through major plague outbreaks. The CCR5 delta 32 mutation, which provides resistance to certain infections including plague, appears at higher rates in European populations than in populations whose ancestors had less plague exposure. Selection pressure from Yersinia pestis was intense enough that the plague literally edited the human genome across the populations it swept through. The survivors were not a random sample of the 1,346 population. They were statistically skewed toward individuals with some biological advantage against the pathogen. Their descendants carry traces of that selection, invisible and permanent, a record of the Black Death written in DNA rather than parchment. Cities can be rebuilt, wages can be renegotiated, theological certainties can be revised, forests grow back. But the genome of a population, shaped over generations by which individuals survived a catastrophe and which did not, carries that event forward indefinitely, long after the last living memory has passed, long after the last plague pit has been built over, and every European whose ancestry traces through the 14th century carries, in some fraction of their cells, a record of who survived. The Renaissance, the end of serfdom, the birth of public health infrastructure, the genetic resilience encoded in surviving bloodlines, all of it downstream of a catastrophe that killed between 75 and 200 million people. There is no clean moral framework that makes that tidy. The Black Death was not good. What it generated was not a justification. But the transformation was real, and pretending otherwise, telling a story where catastrophe produces only grief and nothing else, would be its own kind of lie. What's harder still is recognizing this was not the first time plague had made this kind of intervention in history. The Black Death arrived in 1347 as what historians call the Second Plague Pandemic. The first had struck 8 centuries earlier, not at a fragmented Europe, but at the Eastern Roman Empire at the precise moment its greatest emperor believed he had the pieces in place to restore what Rome had lost. The year is 541 CE, and the Eastern Roman Empire is by almost any measure the most powerful political entity on earth. Constantinople sits at the hinge between Europe and Asia, a city of perhaps 500,000 people, with aqueducts, public baths, a hippodrome seating 100,000, churches whose domes seem to float on columns of light. The emperor is Justinian I, and he is in the middle of something no Roman emperor had managed in over a century: the actual military reconquest of the western territories that had fractured away. His general Belisarius had taken North Africa from the Vandals in 533. By 540, Belisarius had pushed into Italy, captured Ravenna, briefly held Rome itself. Justinian's legal team was simultaneously producing the Corpus Juris Civilis, a codification of Roman law so comprehensive it would form the foundation of legal systems across Europe for the next millennium and a half. The dream of a reunited Roman world was not fantasy. It was, for the first time in generations, operational. The grain came from Egypt, it always had. Enormous cargo ships made the crossing regularly, their holds dark and warm and full of the rats that lived wherever grain was stored in bulk. Somewhere in the rat populations of the Egyptian port cities, most likely near Pelusium at the mouth of the Nile, Yersinia pestis had been circulating. In 541, it made the crossing. What happened next in Constantinople is documented by a man who was actually there. Procopius of Caesarea was Belisarius's personal secretary, a trained historian who understood he was living through something that needed to be recorded even if it could not be understood. His account in the history of the wars is the closest thing antiquity has to a clinical epidemiological report, written by someone without the vocabulary of bacteriology, but with the observational precision of a man who could not look away. He describes the onset: a mild fever, seemingly trivial, the kind that might lift in a day. Then the buboes, swellings appearing in the groin, armpit, or beside the ear, growing to the size of an apple. Some of the sick fell into deep sleep almost immediately, barely conscious. Others were seized by violent delirium, fighting off invisible attackers, screaming at presences only they could see. The doctors, Procopius notes with numbed precision, could determine nothing about why some died and others recovered, because the disease killed arbitrarily. That arbitrariness was, in its way, more terrifying than a killer with rules. Justinian himself fell sick. He developed a bubo and retreated from the public functions of empire, while his court managed the catastrophe around him. He survived. Most of his city did not. At the peak of the outbreak in Constantinople, Procopius records deaths running at 5,000 per day, some modern scholars pushing the estimate toward 10,000. The harbour ran out of ships to carry corpses across the water for burial. Other bodies were stacked in the towers of the city walls, defensive fortifications repurposed as overflow morgues. Imperial officials eventually lifted the roofs off towers along the sea walls and threw the corpses in. Justinian appointed the referendarius, Theodore specifically, to manage the logistics of the dead, a new administrative role, created from scratch, because the existing bureaucracy had no mechanism for processing death at this scale. Total mortality across the first wave of the Justinianic plague, spanning the entire Mediterranean basin from the Levant through North Africa into Western Europe, ranges from 25 to 50 million dead. In a Mediterranean world population perhaps a fifth the size of today's. By high estimates, the Justinianic plague killed between a quarter and a third of the population it touched. A recent scholarship has pushed back hard on the catastrophizing tendency in ancient sources. Archaeologists working across late Roman and early Byzantine sites have found evidence awkward for the narrative of civilization ending collapse. Cities that continue to be occupied, trade networks showing disruption but not obliteration, agricultural patterns that contracted but did not disappear. Procopius and John of Ephesus were writing in a tradition that valued rhetorical intensity. The conventions of late antique historiography encouraged the deployment of disaster in maximalist terms. That doesn't make them wrong, but the numbers deserve scrutiny because dead men and women don't leave literary sources. They leave skeletal remains, pollen cores, coin hoards, and agricultural records still being assembled. What is not contested is the political consequence. Justinian had been running an empire on the assumption that tax revenues would fund wars, wars would produce territory, territory would produce more revenue, and reconquest would feed itself to completion. The plague destroyed that arithmetic. Tax revenues collapsed as taxpayers died. The armies Belisarius needed in Italy could not be adequately funded or replenished from a devastated population. The Italian campaign stalled. The Ostrogoths regrouped. The war dragged on for another 2 decades at staggering cost, producing a peninsula so comprehensively ruined by prolonged military action that it would not recover economically for centuries. And then the plague came back. 18 separate outbreaks are recorded between 541 and approximately 750 CE, more than 2 centuries of recurrence. The waves hit with irregular spacing, a decade of relative quiet, then another eruption, then a few years of respite, then another. Each return found a population beginning to recover, starting to rebuild the demographic and economic base necessary for stability, and carved another piece out of it. The empire Justinian left his successors was not the empire he had inherited, and those successors spent their reigns trying to hold together a structure whose foundations were being eaten away by a disease they could not explain, prevent, or treat. The counterfactual is impossible to answer cleanly, but historians keep asking it because the stakes are so high. If those grain ships from Egypt carry only wheat, if Yersinia pestis doesn't make the crossing in 541, Belisarius's Italian campaign, well-funded and reinforced, probably concludes within the decade. Justinian holds Italy, North Africa, Spain's southern coast, the Balkans, the Levant, Egypt. Does the Lombard invasion of Italy in 568 still occur, into a peninsula already devastated by 2 decades of war and plague? Does the Arab expansion of the 630s and 640s find the exhausted, underpopulated borders it found, or does it encounter a different kind of resistance? Nobody can answer any of those questions. What can be said is that the world the Arab armies moved into in the 7th century was significantly different from the world that would have existed without 2 centuries of intermittent plague. Whether the Islamic expansion happens as it did, at the speed it did, across the geography it did, in a plague-free Mediterranean, that is one of the great unanswerable questions in Western historical speculation. By around 750 CE, the records of major outbreaks stop. For the next 6 centuries, until those Genoese ships arrived at Messina in October 1347, Yersinia pestis is largely absent from the European documentary record. Why is genuinely unknown. One argument focuses on climate. The medieval climate optimum may have pushed plague reservoirs out of the geographic zones where they could most readily contact human trade networks. Another points to genetics. The same selective pressure that elevated CCR5 delta 32 frequencies may have raised the baseline resistance of the Byzantine population to levels that made sustained transmission harder to maintain. There is the possibility that the reservoir populations in Central Asia simply contracted and disconnected from the vectors carrying them westward, for ecological reasons having nothing to do with human decisions at all. The honest answer is that we do not know why the Justinianic plague stopped, any more than medieval physicians knew why it had started. The pattern, emergence, devastation, recurrence, silence, re-emergence centuries later, is real. The explanation for the silence is not. What we can say is that those 6 centuries without major plague pandemic were not centuries without disease. To understand how earlier pathogens were reshaping civilization before Yersinia pestis ever arrived at port, you have to go back further still. Past Justinian, past Rome at its height, all the way to the 5th century BCE, to Athens, in the 2nd year of a war it believed it was going to win, when something moved through its crowded streets that no one has definitively identified since. Athens in the summer of 430 BCE is, by its own accounting, the centre of the world. The Parthenon is 40 years old and still gleaming. The Agora hums with argument. 6 months earlier, Pericles had delivered what history would remember as the funeral oration, a speech defining Athenian democracy not merely as a system of government, but as a moral achievement, the highest form of organised human life yet attempted. The gods, the logic went, are favoured Athens. The evidence was everywhere. The empire, the fleet, the architecture, the philosophy, the law. Then something arrived that the gods did not stop. It came from Ethiopia, Thucydides tells us. It passed through Egypt and Libya before crossing the sea. It entered Athens through the port of Piraeus, moving through a city dangerously overcrowded by Pericles' strategic decision to pull the rural population inside the long walls, connecting Athens to its harbour, abandoning the Attic countryside to Spartan devastation and relying on naval supremacy. The strategy was rational. The consequence was tens of thousands of people crammed into makeshift camps, sharing water, sharing air, sharing whatever the arriving ships had brought. Thucydides was not a physician, but he survived the plague. He mentions this almost in passing, as one of the facts that allowed him to observe, and what he produced in the 2nd book of his History of the Peloponnesian War is the earliest systematic attempt in Western literature to describe a disease's clinical progression from onset to outcome. He understood that the description itself was the evidence, and that evidence needed to outlast the moment. The eyes became inflamed first, red, burning, sensitive to light. Then the throat and tongue turned a bloody colour, the breath foul. Sneezing followed, hoarseness, a violent cough, then retching, then convulsive vomiting of bile. The body erupted in pustules and ulcers, the skin reddened in blotches. Patients could not bear the touch of clothing and threw off everything they wore, plunging themselves into cisterns and wells, yet was trying to extinguish a thirst that water could not quench. Their bodies wasted with extraordinary speed. Those who survived the initial phase often lost fingers, toes, or their sight. Some survived with no memory of who they were. Doctors have been reading that description for 24 centuries and arguing about what it describes. Typhus matches some features: the rash, the neurological symptoms, the lethality in confined populations. But the vomiting pattern doesn't align cleanly. Smallpox accounts for the pustules and eye involvement, but the thirst and speed of mortality don't match classical smallpox presentation. Measles has been proposed. Toxic shock syndrome has been proposed. Most startling to modern readers, some researchers have argued for a disease resembling Ebola, pointing to hemorrhagic features and the speed of death in severe cases, though the mechanisms for spread at this scale without more obvious traces in neighbouring populations are difficult to explain. There are scholars who suggest not a single disease, but a simultaneous outbreak of multiple pathogens in a population weakened by malnutrition and overcrowding, which would explain why no single modern diagnosis maps cleanly onto Thucydides' account. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Greek archaeologists excavating a mass burial site at the Kerameikos cemetery in Athens found a pit containing the remains of at least 150 individuals interred hastily and without normal funerary rites. DNA analysis was attempted, and the results have been tantalizing and inconclusive in equal measure. One study in 2006 reported finding DNA sequences consistent with typhoid fever in dental pulp from several individuals. Subsequent researchers disputed the methodology, the contamination controls, and the interpretation. The Kerameikos DNA has not settled the question. It has deepened it. Between 75,000 and 100,000 people died in Athens during the outbreak years, in a city-state of perhaps 300,000, a civilizational wound. The plague killed physicians in greater numbers than average, Thucydides notes, because they were the ones spending the most time near the sick. In 429 BCE, it killed Pericles himself, the man who had made Athens what it was, the architect of the Parthenon, the author of the funeral oration. The strategic mind behind Athens' wartime posture developed the disease, lingered, and died. Athens would continue fighting for another 26 years, but the years immediately following the epidemic saw the city's confidence in its own divine favour shattered in ways no military defeat alone would have produced. Thucydides observed something beyond the medical. People who expected to die stopped observing the laws and norms that governed Athenian life. Religious observance collapsed, not because citizens rejected the gods philosophically, but because the temples were full of dying people, and the gods had visibly done nothing. The bodies of the dying lay atop the bodies of the dead. Survivors who had endured the disease believed themselves immune and moved freely where others could not, are an entire society's framework for understanding suffering, divine favour, and collective responsibility fractured inside a few months. This was not a background event. It was a civilization processing the revelation that the universe did not protect the righteous. 6 centuries later, the Roman Empire encountered something whose identity is contested in different ways. In 165 CE, the legions of Lucius Verus returned from a campaign against the Parthian Empire, coming back victorious, hauling plunder and prisoners, and carrying something invisible in their baggage trains. Modern historians call it the Antonine Plague. The most widely accepted candidate is smallpox, though some researchers have proposed measles, either alone or in combination, as better fitting certain aspects of the recorded mortality patterns. What is established is the scale. Over the 15 years it circulated through the empire, it killed an estimated 5 million people. In some communities, mortality during outbreak periods reached a quarter or a third of the local population. The physician who made the most systematic effort to understand it was Galen of Pergamon. Claudius Galenus, imperial physician, the most influential medical mind of the ancient world, and the man whose theoretical framework would dominate Western medicine for 14 centuries after his death. Galen watched the Antonine Plague with the same clinical commitment Thucydides had brought to Athens. His descriptions, preserved across a body of work so large it constitutes one of antiquity's great literary monuments, became the foundational text for how doctors in medieval Europe and the Islamic world conceptualized epidemic disease. He was wrong about the mechanisms, embedded in a humoral framework with no room for germ theory, but the observations themselves, the careful attention to symptom progression and variation across patients, established a methodological standard that shaped how medicine thought about mass death for over 1,000 years. Marcus Aurelius, emperor during the plague's most lethal years, one of the most philosophically serious men ever to hold imperial power, spent his reign simultaneously managing military crises on the Danube frontier and a pandemic hollowing out the population that funded every campaign. His meditations, written in private in the field, are suffused with a stoic acceptance of mortality that reads differently once you know what he was watching die around him. Less than a century later, Rome faced something worse. The Plague of Cyprian, named for the Bishop of Carthage who wrote about it, struck in 249 CE and recurred in waves until approximately 262. At its peak in Rome, contemporary sources record 5,000 deaths per day in the city alone. 5,000 per day in a single city. The death rate across the empire during peak outbreak periods may have reached 1/3 of the exposed population in some regions. The leading contemporary hypotheses include viral hemorrhagic fever, something in the filovirus family related to but distinct from Ebola, and pandemic influenza. The hemorrhagic fever argument rests on descriptions of bloody diarrhea, gangrenous extremities, and the speed of death in severe cases. Neither is confirmed. Ancient DNA work on Cyprian-era burial sites has been attempted at Luxor in Egypt, where a mass grave contemporary with the epidemic was discovered in 2014, the bodies covered in lime, the ancient world's version of a biohazard protocol. The genetic results have been partial. The identification remains provisional. What no one disputes is that the Plague of Cyprian arrived during the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years during which Rome cycled through dozens of emperors, most killed by their own soldiers, while borders frayed and currency debased. Whether disease caused this crisis or catastrophically amplified an existing one, the Cyprian plague and the crisis of the 3rd century are so temporally entangled that separating their effects is nearly impossible. By the time the epidemic receded, the particular Rome of Augustus, of Trajan, of the Antonines, confident, expansionist, certain of its own permanence, was gone. And then there are the diseases that never receive the full accounting they deserve, not because they were minor, but because they defied even the categories available to describe them. The English sweating sickness appeared without warning in August 1485, arriving, or at least being first recorded, in the army of Henry Tudor just before the Battle of Bosworth Field, the engagement that ended the Wars of the Roses and planted the Tudor dynasty on the English throne, what is documented across 5 distinct epidemic waves: 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528 and 1551, is a disease that killed with a brutality of speed unlike almost anything else in the historical record. Onset to death in severe cases, hours, sometimes less. A person could wake healthy, feel the first shiver by noon, and be dead before dark. The symptoms began with sudden shivering and a sense of dread, not pain, but apprehension, followed by violent sweating, exhaustion, delirium, and in fatal cases cardiac collapse. It struck the healthy and prosperous with notable frequency, unlike most epidemic diseases that concentrated worst effects among the malnourished poor. Henry VIII was terrified of it, with a consistency his biographers treat as one of his defining psychological traits. One of his earliest close companions, William Compton, died of it in the 1517 outbreak. The sweat seemed drawn to the court, to the well-fed, to exactly the people epidemic disease usually passed over. After 1551, it stopped. Completely. Permanently. It has never returned. No disease in the modern canon matches the sweating sickness's clinical profile. Hantavirus has been proposed. Influenza variants have been proposed. Historians of medicine have argued it may not have been a single disease entity at all, but rather a category applied to several distinct illnesses sharing the cardinal feature of rapid sweating onset. What cannot be explained on any current theory is why something this distinctive, this lethal, and this thoroughly documented simply ceased to exist. The disappearance is as disorienting as the disease itself, and if the sweating sickness represents epidemic mystery at the lethal end, something else from the same medieval period represents it at the purely inexplicable end, a phenomenon so strange that modern readers consistently assume it must be myth, and consistently discover that the documentation is far more solid than they expected. Beginning in 1374 in the Rhineland along the river Moselle, people began to dance. Not celebratory dancing, uncontrollable dancing. Crowds moving through streets for hours, then days, unable to stop, screaming, laughing, crying, apparently in tremendous pain but incapable of ceasing the movement. Some collapsed and died of exhaustion or cardiac failure. Some danced until their feet bled. The phenomenon recurred. In 1518 in Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophea began dancing alone in the street in July and could not stop. Within a week, dozens had joined her. Within a month, the number had grown to perhaps 400. The city authorities, responding with what passed for medical wisdom at the time, brought in musicians, believing the dancing needed to be danced out, and opened guild halls for the afflicted to continue under supervision. People died. The dancing eventually stopped. What caused it remains genuinely unresolved. Ergot poisoning from contaminated rye flour has been proposed as a trigger for numerous episodes of mass behaviour anomalies in medieval and early modern Europe, but ergotism's physiological effects don't precisely match the dancing mania accounts, and the geographic and temporal clustering suggests something more than a consistent food contaminant. Mass psychogenic illness, a collective stress response manifesting in shared physical symptoms, has been advanced by the historian John Waller as the most coherent explanation, locating the episodes within periods of intense social stress, famine, and epidemic fear. The population experiencing dancing mania in 1374 and 1518 had been living through decades of plague, crop failure, and religious anxiety. Both explanations might be partially correct. The archives contain what they contain, and what they contain is hundreds of people dancing until they died, and a medical tradition that had no vocabulary for it, and a modern scholarship that has better vocabulary but not yet a definitive answer. What these episodes share, from Athens in 430 BCE through Strasbourg in 1518, is not just mortality. What they share is the particular vertigo of facing something the available intellectual tools cannot process. Every society built categories for understanding suffering. Every category failed at the edge of epidemic. The disease that couldn't be named, couldn't be propitiated, couldn't be avoided with the right rituals or medicine or prayer, couldn't be bargained with. It simply moved. The ancient and early medieval world produced no instrument capable of seeing inside that process. It produced only witnesses. Some of them, like Thucydides and Galen, were witnesses of extraordinary acuity, leaving records precise enough that 21st century geneticists are still arguing over their implications. Others left only numbers and mass graves in the absence of the people who once lived there. What changes the story is not faith, and not philosophy. It's a very specific kind of knowledge that communities are forced to learn, often by catastrophe, often too late. One community in 1665 would learn it in the most personal terms imaginable, by choosing to become a controlled experiment in epidemic containment, at a price measured in nearly 3/4 of their neighbours, their families, and themselves. The package arrived in early September 1665. A bolt of cloth sent from London to the village of Eyam in Derbyshire, a lead mining settlement of perhaps 350 souls tucked into a limestone valley in the Peak District, far enough from the capital that its residents had been watching the Great Plague of London as a distant catastrophe, something happening to other people in another world. The cloth went to a tailor named George Vickers, who spread it out to air near his hearth. Within days he was dead. The swellings under his arms were the kind that Londoners had learned to recognise and run from. By the time winter arrived and the cold slowed the fleas, 23 villagers were already gone. This is where William Mompesson enters the story. He was the village rector, 28 years old, relatively new to Eyam, not universally beloved, a man who had arrived representing a religious establishment that many of his parishioners viewed with suspicion after decades of civil war and sectarian upheaval. What he had was a clear-eyed understanding of what the disease was, where it had been, and where it would go if the people of Eyam walked out of their valley into the surrounding Peak District villages, the way they normally would when harvest time came and markets opened. He talked to them. He preached to them. He persuaded them, with Thomas Stanley, the former rector who maintained a following among the village's nonconformists, two men who disagreed on theology agreeing on this, that Eyam should close its borders, voluntarily. No soldiers were posted at the lanes leading out. People could leave. The decision, insofar as any collective decision made under conditions of terror and pastoral authority can be called voluntary, was theirs. Mompesson wrote to his children, safely away in Yorkshire, and the letter survives. The condition of this place, he told them, is so infectious that I could not with safe conscience invite you hither. Not I cannot, not you must not, could not with safe conscience. The moral weight on the man who made this choice, while simultaneously choosing to stay himself, sits in the grammar of that phrase. His wife Catherine stayed with him. She died in August 1666 after the agreement was already in place and already costing the village its people. The containment line was marked by a boundary stone, a flat rock at the village perimeter, unremarkable to look at, one of the most morally freighted objects in English history. Holes had been drilled into its surface. Surrounding villagers left food and supplies at the stone. The people of Eyam left payment in these holes, coins soaked in vinegar, thought to neutralise contagion from the metal. To make the transaction safe for the person reaching into the hole to retrieve what had been left by dying hands. Two sets of hands, separated by a few feet of stone and an invisible catastrophe, the transaction conducted in sour liquid and silence, because proximity was death, but commerce and community still required acknowledgement. The mathematics are plain and pitiless. By the time the epidemic in Eyam finally exhausted itself, more than 260 of the 350 villagers were dead, 74%. In the surrounding villages, there is documented evidence of no comparable outbreak. Whether the quarantine was the decisive factor, or whether the epidemic had already burned through the available susceptible population. By the time it might have spread further, historians debate. What is not seriously debated is that Eyam contained itself, and that the countryside beyond survived intact. But the question that containment raises has no comfortable resolution. A rector in a 17th century English village was not simply a religious figure. He was part of the institutional architecture of a society where deference to religious authority was close to mandatory, where the consequences of visibly defying that authority were social, spiritual, and sometimes legal. When Mompesson stood at the pulpit and framed the quarantine as a moral obligation, as what God required, was he offering his congregation a genuine choice, or dressing a death sentence in the language of virtue? The people who left were never retrospectively condemned. The ones who stayed were later celebrated as heroes, which made it somewhat harder for anyone to ask whether heroism and pressure might have been difficult to distinguish from inside the situation. Who has the right to ask a community to die for strangers? Not to risk death, not to accept hardship, to die. With 74% mortality, the outcome for many was never genuinely uncertain. Montesson framed it as a choice freely given. The centuries since have framed it as sublime collective sacrifice. Both framings may be true simultaneously, and neither erases the other. 54 years later, and 1,000 miles south, the same terrible calculation was made again, this time by people with no choice in the matter at all. The Grand Saint-Antoine arrived in Marseille in May 1720 from the Levant, carrying silk, cotton, and Yersinia pestis. The ship had stopped in several eastern Mediterranean ports where plague was active. Several sailors had died during the voyage. The vessel was met by health officials who ordered it into quarantine. The same Venetian system of enforced delay, by now 3 centuries old and standard in Mediterranean commerce. The quarantine should have held. It did not hold because powerful men did not want it to hold. The cargo aboard was valuable. The Marseille merchant community and the city's officials connected to that community had financial interest in those silk bales. The ship was allowed into port, the cargo was offloaded. Whatever was living in the fabric and the rats of the hold moved into the city. By summer, Marseille was dying. By autumn, the city of 90,000 had lost 50,000 of its people, a mortality rate that compressed into months what the Black Death had distributed across years in many of the cities it visited. Jean-Baptiste Bertrand, a physician who stayed through the entire epidemic and later wrote a detailed account, described streets deserted, all shops closed, the sound reduced to the cries of the dying and the mournful tolling of bells. A city of noise and commerce and the particular vitality of one of France's great ports reduced, in the span of weeks, to silence and grief. Bertrand wrote it down 3 centuries ago, and it reads like dispatches from 2020. The French government's response was not Eyam's moral persuasion. It was architecture. Le Mur de la Peste, the plague wall, was ordered constructed across Provence, stretching roughly 27 kilometres through the limestone hills north of the infected region. 2 metres high in places, built specifically to delineate the territory that would be sacrificed and the territory that would be protected. Soldiers were posted along its length with orders to fire on anyone attempting to cross from the infected side. The logic was explicit and unsentimentally articulated. Marseille and its surrounding communities were already dying, and saving the rest of France meant enforcing a boundary those communities could not be trusted to maintain voluntarily. The plague wall is political philosophy translated into stone and mortar. Every course of rock laid across that Provençal hillside embodies a calculation. These lives, on this side, matter less than those lives on that side. The state drew a line. The line had soldiers. The soldiers had orders. The question of whether the people inside the line consented to being there did not arise, because the question was not considered relevant. The nobles and officials who had actually caused the outbreak by letting the Grand Saint-Antoine dock never faced the wall. They were on the correct side of it. Eyam and Marseille are 54 years apart, and a civilization's width apart in how they approach the same essential problem. In Derbyshire, a rector asked a village of lead miners to choose sacrifice, framing it as moral agency, as something given rather than taken. In Provence, a government ordered construction and posted soldiers. One story gets told as heroism, the other gets told as policy. Both resulted in a boundary the living could not cross without putting others at risk. Both resulted in the dead staying on their side of it. The stones of the Eyam boundary marker still sit in the valley. The Mur de la Peste still traces its line through the hills of Provence. The remaining sections preserved as historical monument. 2 physical objects encoding the same moral structure from completely different angles, and together defining the range of options available to any society that has not yet developed the tool that would make both approaches seem less brutally blunt. That tool was not spiritual conviction. It was not architecture. It was the capacity to see the enemy, to identify it precisely, to understand exactly how it moved and where it lived and what killed it. A century and a half after Marseille buried its 50,000 dead, a physician with a map in London Soho would begin constructing that capacity, one documented death at a time. Bengal, 1817. A disease that had circulated in the Ganges Delta for centuries, local, contained, endemic to the waterways and rice paddies of northeastern India, suddenly crossed the invisible boundary between regional killer and global catastrophe. No one is certain what triggered the transition. British military movements, a particularly wet monsoon season, the accelerating trade infrastructure of the East India Company, connecting Bengal to the rest of the subcontinent and beyond. Whatever the mechanism, Vibrio cholerae escaped its geographic cradle for the first time in recorded history. It travelled along roads and rivers and shipping lanes. By 1820 it had reached Southeast Asia. By 1823, the Persian Gulf. The first pandemic killed hundreds of thousands, and then receded, and for a brief window people who did not understand pandemics believed it had ended. It had not ended, it had rested. The second pandemic began in 1829, and this time it reached Europe and the Americas. The third arrived in 1852, and the Russian Empire alone counted over 1 million dead. By the time the seventh pandemic began in 1961, cholera had visited every inhabited continent multiple times and had been killing for 140 years without ceasing. To understand why cholera was so devastating, you have to understand exactly what it does to a body. A person perfectly well at breakfast could be dying by dinner. The mechanism was dehydration on a scale that seemed impossible. Profuse watery diarrhea with the distinctive appearance of cloudy rice water, total loss of gut barrier function, the body essentially liquefying itself from the inside. A patient could lose 20 litres of fluid in a single day. The skin, starved of moisture, would turn greyish-blue, losing elasticity. Press it, and it would stay pressed, a test doctors called tenting. The eyes sank into the skull. The heartbeat became erratic and then stopped. Death could come within hours of the first symptom. And because cholera spreads through fecal contamination of water, the very act of dying, the uncontrollable purging, was simultaneously the mechanism of transmission. A single person dying of cholera in a household sharing a water source could kill everyone downstream. In the crowded, poorly sewered industrial cities of the 19th century, almost everyone was downstream of almost everyone else. Though Victorian medicine watched this unfold and reached, with complete confidence, entirely the wrong conclusion. The dominant theory was miasma, disease arising from the poisonous vapours emanating from rotting organic matter. This theory had the advantage of being partially correct about a real observation. Disease did cluster around filth and poverty and rotting matter. It was completely wrong about the mechanism. Miasma theory pointed at the right address and then explained why the house was dangerous in the most catastrophically misleading way possible. If disease came through air, the solution was ventilation, fumigation, the burning of sulphur in sick rooms. These interventions did almost nothing to stop cholera. Worse, they actively directed attention away from water. Doctors who believed in miasma had no reason to investigate the pump. They were busy smelling the air. John Snow looked at the relationship between sewage and drinking water differently. He was 39 years old in 1849 when he published a small pamphlet called On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, arguing on the basis of careful observation, rather than any laboratory evidence, because the tools for laboratory evidence did not yet exist, that the disease spread through contaminated water, not bad air. The pamphlet was received with polite dismissal. Snow was a respected physician, a pioneer in anaesthesia who had administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during childbirth. He was not a crank. He was ignored anyway, because his argument, if correct, carried implications the establishment was not prepared to accept. 5 years later, in August 1854, cholera broke out in the Soho district of London with ferocious intensity. 500 people died in a 10-day period within a few streets of each other. A concentration so acute it was almost geometrically precise. Snow began knocking on doors. He was not looking for miasma. He was looking for a shared source. What he produced was a map, one of the most consequential documents in the history of public health. On a detailed street plan of Soho, Snow plotted every cholera death he could verify, marking each with a black bar. The cluster centred on a single point, a water pump on Broad Street. He interviewed surviving residents, traced the movements of the dead, documented who had drunk from the pump and who had not. He found a workhouse nearby whose residents had largely been spared. They had their own well. He found a brewery whose workers had been almost entirely untouched. They drank beer rather than water, a fact Snow recorded without apparent irony as epidemiological evidence. He found a woman in Hampstead, miles from Soho, who had died of cholera, and learned she had specifically requested water from the Broad Street pump, delivered to her by a relative who carried it by cart because she preferred its taste. The water had travelled miles. The disease travelled with it. Snow went to the Board of Guardians for the St James's Parish and made his case. The pump handle was removed. The outbreak, already subsiding naturally as the local population had been largely either killed or infected, slowed. And Snow's map, the act of visually rendering where death lived, of tracing its geography back to a single mechanism, was genuinely revolutionary. It was a new way of thinking about disease entirely. The medical establishment still didn't believe him. The Board of Inquiry that investigated the Broad Street outbreak in 1855 acknowledged Snow's findings, then attributed the cluster to miasma anyway. The General Board of Health produced a report rejecting the water theory that same year, the year Snow published the expanded second edition of his book. The leading proponent of miasma theory, sanitarian reformer William Farr, a man who had genuinely improved public health outcomes through his statistical work, rejected Snow's conclusions for years, not from stupidity but from the particular stubbornness of a worldview that has produced results and therefore resists replacement. What Snow was asking the medical establishment to accept was not merely a different theory of transmission. He was asking them to accept that London, capital of the most powerful empire on earth, had constructed its civilization on a foundation that was poisoning its citizens. The sewers of London in the 1850s did not carry waste to treatment facilities. No treatment facilities existed. They carried waste to the Thames. The Thames supplied drinking water to the eastern and southern neighbourhoods of the city. The wealthy, whose waste also went into the Thames, were further upstream. The poor drank what the wealthy discarded. Snow's water theory, accepted, made that a governmental crisis. Miasma theory, maintained, made it a problem of individual exposure to bad smells, manageable by the poor through personal virtue, through not living in filthy conditions, through the kind of individual moral improvement that Victorian ideology preferred to structural reform. The Thames itself eventually made the argument Snow could not make through persuasion alone. In the summer of 1858, hot and dry, the river lower than usual, decades of sewage deposits baking in the sun, the smell became so overwhelming that Parliament, sitting directly on the Thames, was forced to hang sheets soaked in chloride of lime across its windows. The great stink lasted 3 months. It accomplished in one summer what Snow's epidemiology had not accomplished in a decade. Parliament approved funding. Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, began building. What Bazalgette built was extraordinary by any measure. 318 kilometres of interconnected underground brick tunnels, constructed between 1859 and 1875, carrying London's waste east of the city and away from the drinking water supply. The project required 82 million bricks. It redirected the sewage of 3.5 million people, completed at a cost of roughly £4.5 million, an enormous public expenditure for a government genuinely ideologically hostile to public expenditure. And it worked. cholera deaths in London dropped dramatically, not because anyone had treated a single patient differently, because people stopped drinking sewage. Basil Gett's sewers did not require understanding of germ theory to function. They required pipes and gravity, and the acknowledgement, however reluctant, however politically extracted, that dense urban populations could not sustain themselves without infrastructure that matched their density. The lesson is uncomfortable, because it suggests that what often moves public health forward is not the quality of the evidence, but the proximity of the smell. Russia, across the same decades, was learning a darker variation. The third pandemic killed over 1 million people in the Russian Empire, and the collision of mass death with a population that had no reason to trust its government produced cholera riots, not protests, but violent uprisings in which terrified people attacked the doctors and officials overseeing quarantine measures, convinced that authorities were not containing the disease but spreading it, that hospitals were death camps, that quarantine cordons were instruments of political suppression dressed in medical language. Physicians were killed, quarantine stations were destroyed, the riots were put down by force. The Russian experience made explicit what the English experience kept slightly implicit. Epidemic disease and social order do not coexist easily, and the trust required for public health measures to function is a political achievement, not a given. Where that trust has been corroded by inequality, by historical abuse of state power, by the visible fact that the dying are concentrated among those the state has already failed, the medical response becomes inseparable from the political crisis. 7 pandemics. The 7th is not historical in the sense the previous 6 are. It began in Indonesia in 1961, spread through Asia, Africa and Europe through the 1970s, reached the Americas, and remains technically active today. Cholera is a disease that the developed world has essentially solved through infrastructure and is simultaneously allowing to continue killing in the places where that infrastructure has not been built. The solution has been known and available for over a century: clean water and functional sewage treatment. The continued death toll from a disease whose mechanism is fully understood and whose prevention requires no new science is, if you're looking at it clearly, a choice. The Broad Street pump handle hangs in a pub in Soho now, a few metres from where Snow removed the original. It is a piece of secular hagiography for the founding of epidemiology. And what it represents, the act of a single physician deciding that the map was more authoritative than the theory, that the deaths had a geometry, and the geometry had a source, remains the foundational methodology of every outbreak investigation since. Snow answered those questions with ink on paper and the authority of nothing except his own meticulous attention to where people died and what they drank. He did not have a microscope. He did not have a bacterium. He did not have the tool that would finally make the enemy visible rather than merely trackable. The thing in the water remained invisible to him, even as he proved its location beyond reasonable doubt. That visibility was 40 years away, and when it came, it would arrive not in London's sewers but in a makeshift laboratory in a dying city, where a young French-Swiss scientist was racing against time and institutional rivalry both, trying to name a killer that had haunted humanity since before written history. Hong Kong in the early summer of 1894 was a city coming apart at the seams. The streets of the Taiping Shan district, the oldest residential quarter on the island, dense and overcrowded and built without meaningful sanitation infrastructure, had taken on the quality of silence that people who have witnessed epidemic disease recognize immediately. Not the silence of quiet, the silence of a place that has stopped functioning, shops shuttered, children kept indoors, the sound of carts moving at all hours and no one wanting to look at what the carts carried. The health officers who moved through those streets in May and June of 1894 left behind reports that read, in their deliberate bureaucratic flatness, are some of the most disturbing documents in the annals of public health. House 27, third floor, 5 dead, 2 sick. House 29, ground floor, 2 dead, corpse in advanced state of decomposition. House 31, Entire family of 7 deceased found by smell. That final phrase, found by smell, is the one that stops you. Someone had opened a door and the door had told them what they needed to know before they even crossed the threshold. What had arrived in Hong Kong was something the world had not confronted in any organised medical sense since the 14th century. Bubonic plague, the disease of the Black Death. It had been largely absent from European records since the 18th century, creating a comfortable, false impression that it was gone. It was not gone. It had been incubating, was spreading through animal reservoirs in the remote interior of southwestern China, in Yunnan province, for decades. As trade routes expanded and population movement accelerated, it had been working toward the coast. By 1894, it had reached a British colonial port city connected by steamship to every corner of the globe. The third plague pandemic had begun. 2 men arrived in Hong Kong within days of each other that June. Shibasaburo Kitasato was a Japanese bacteriologist of enormous reputation, trained under Robert Koch in Berlin, who had already successfully isolated the tetanus and diphtheria bacilli. He arrived with a team, well funded, and the British colonial authorities, whose instinctive hierarchies followed the logic of empire, granted him access to properly equipped laboratory space at Kennedy Town Hospital. The facility had microscopes, sterilization equipment, working conditions that research required. The other man was Alexandre Yersin, 31 years old, French-Swiss, a protégé of Louis Pasteur, a researcher who had spent recent years not in well-appointed European laboratories,